In the house of Manilov, Chichikov meets two rather, shall we say, charming or perhaps not so charming children. Themistocles, the Russian form of Themistocles, and Alcibiades, the Russian form of Alcibiades. For some reason or other, the kids, the young children of Manilov, have taken on Greek, or have been given Greek names. When Themistocles is asked questions, he seems to reply with very deep knowledge. For example, he knows that the most important city in France is Paris. The two most important cities in Russia are Moscow and Petersburg. What a delightful child, what a brilliant child. I think he's going to be an ambassador, says Manilov. But all of a sudden, something starts to drip out of the nose of the future ambassador. Something starts to drip out of the future ambassador's nose, and his tutor has to reach over and wipe his face. And meanwhile, his brother is inspecting a beetle. Well, the younger brother's not so bright, but he's going to be a beetle inspector someday. In the creation of these characters, Gogol gives you a sense of both the richness and I'm tempted to say the dirt. That's perhaps a little bit unfair. The very strong, particularly Russian kind of life that exists in the countryside. Of course, when Chichikov broaches his scheme to buy dead serfs from Manilov, Manilov is terribly surprised, doesn't know how to react. He says, well, is this legal? Oh, yes, says Chichikov, don't you worry. It's totally legal and will help the treasury of the country. They'll get money from this. Well, in that case, says Manilov, all right. How much do you want? Asks Chichikov. Says, I wouldn't think of charging you for something like dead souls. Well, then Chichikov then travels onward to find somebody else in the countryside, and he arrives at the estate of the widow Korobotchka. Korobotchka in Russian means a little box. He comes in the middle of the night because they've been caught in a rainstorm and his carriage has fallen over. He's covered with mud. She's, good heavens, you're covered with mud. She says, well, they take off the clothes. She's going to wash them. Well, little father of mine, she says, I guess I can let you stay this evening. Perhaps you'd like to sleep. She takes him into a room where the feather beds are piled up almost to the ceiling. Poor old Manilov doesn't quite know how to get to the feather beds, but he takes a flying leap and he lands on top. The feather beds are so soft that although they go up to the ceiling, his weight brings him all the way down to the floor. And as it does, feathers are flying in every direction. Of course, these feathers, in a certain sense, stand for the desires of Korobotchka, who wants to sell him all kinds of goods in the countryside. And so he spends the night sleeping very, very sweetly on this very, very soft mound of feather beds that goes up to the ceiling, but comes all the way down to the floor when he sleeps on it. This, of course, is typical for Gogol's style. When he broached his scheme to her the next morning, she was terribly upset. What do you mean, sell dead souls? What? How can one do this? She gives him such a hard time that he tells her, go to the devil. She said, oh, don't talk about the devil. I'm terribly frightened of the devil. If the devil comes in, I'm in terrible trouble. Look, she said, you want to buy dead serfs? How about some bast? How about buying some other things from me? He says, no, I don't want bast. I want dead souls. Well, finally, he manages to get her to sign a deed of sale, and everything works. Well, this goes continually through a whole series of landowners in the Russian countryside. You meet Nozdryov, Mr. Nostrils, who's a real scoundrel, who starts out being very friendly to Chichikov, and all of a sudden wants him to get involved in a game of gambling. Chichikov, of course, doesn't want to do any gambling. All he wants is to buy serfs. But Nozdryov is so insistent that finally he sits down at the table, and of course, as soon as he does, Nozdryov starts cheating. Chichikov accuses him of cheating. Nozdryov gets very angry. He calls in his servants to beat him. Poor old Chichikov is suddenly subject to a potential beating from two servants, and Nozdryov himself, who has a stick in his hand, when suddenly the police come and arrest Nozdryov. You get the idea that here there's a fantasy going on, a fantasy which sometimes turns into a nightmare, a fantasy which sometimes turns into a very rich production of different characters, but out of dead souls, what you get is a fantastically boiling and moving kind of life. This is Gogol's creation in this particular novel. We meet Sebakevich, who is solid as a bear. At one point, Sebakevich turns and accidentally steps on Chichikov's foot, and the poor guy, the foot hurts for a week from the bulk and the clumsiness of Sebakevich. Well, as you might imagine, the scheme blows up in Chichikov's face. People in the town start to talk about it, and the first thing you know, the government is interested in investigating just who is the swindler, what's he doing, and Chichikov is forced to flee. And of course, he flees in his troika. You remember the fastest of vehicles in Russia in those days. And there's a final section, a final paragraph, which again has become kind of classic in Russian literature, because what Gogol does is to give you the picture of that troika, which is flying off. The troika is going along at a tremendously swift pace. As it's going along, peasants are watching it, and Gogol says, "Ah, you steeds, you magnificent steeds, are there windstorms caught in your manes? You've heard the song from on high, and you're straining your bronze chest with your hoofs barely scraping the ground. You've become one stretched out line, flying through the air. You dash along inspired by God. O Rus!" He uses the old term for Rus, you remember from the early lectures, going way back to the origins of the East Slavs. Of course, in the Russian imagination, Rus has a very abstract and a very spiritual connotation. O Rus, whither art thou hurtling? Kuda voi? Give us an answer. It gives no answer. It flies past everything on this earth, while other people and states, looking askance, step aside and let it pass through. What an invocation of Rus! What an invocation of Russia. And of course, this line was quoted many, many times to represent Russia's grandeur, Russia's greatness. There's only one little problem. When they quote this, they forget one tiny thing, that inside this magnificent troika sits a petty chiseler and deceiver named Chichikov. And of course, if you're talking about the grandeur of Russia, then you have to remember that inside this grandeur is nothing but a petty thief, a petty crook. And of course, today, when people use that same phrase, Rus, kuda, it's known as a very ironic and an almost savagely ironic story. Yes, where is Russia going? We may have great fears about where Russia may be going. It's a very rich image with which he ends this first part. Later on, of course, he tried to write a second part where he would redeem Chichikov. He would no longer be a swindler, but rather he would be reformed because he took on religion, he realized his sins, and so on. The second part simply doesn't work. Swindlers like Chichikov are not made for heaven or for paradise. They're much more at home in hell among the devils. And Gogol's art suffered a considerable diminution at that point. As Gogol went on in this vein, he began to, perhaps something happened in his mind, perhaps something happened in his psyche, he began to go in a very different direction. He began to turn into a kind of a moralist who was trying to defend the Tsarist system, was trying to defend the landowners, the whole system of serfdom. Having exposed many of the evils of serfdom, now all of a sudden he's beginning to praise the institution of serfdom. There's a book called A Series of Letters, A Series of Correspondence with Friends, where he begins to write letters that are very strange, that make people think that Gogol has sort of taken leave of his senses. He says to the landowners, "Look, stand up before your peasants. They think that you're interested in money. You show them that you're not interested in money. You're interested only in their moral welfare. Take a 10-ruble note, and before their eyes, take a match and set fire to it, and show that you care nothing about money, that you only care about their moral stature, you only care about their welfare." He also wrote a letter of condolence, which had become a kind of a classic in its old cockeyed way. A poor acquaintance of his had lost his wife. And of course, it was more, you can imagine what kind of mourning he was in, how upset he was. So Gogol wrote him a letter saying, "My dear friend, you have never been a gentleman in the past. You have been an evil person, a kind of a scoundrel in the past. But now this is a very good thing that you've lost your wife, because maybe the loss of your wife and the mourning you go into will turn you into a gentleman." I think you would agree with me that this is a, shall we say, somewhat original way of writing a letter of condolence to a friend who's lost a wife. People began to think that Gogol had either become insane or was perhaps something even worse. He was a cowardly turncoat from some of his best earlier writing. Here was Gogol, who had written the Inspector General, who had showed the corruption of Russia and how that corruption happened. Here was Gogol, the author of The Overcoat, who showed the suffering of the poor people in Russia. Here was Gogol, the author of Dead Souls, who showed these perhaps attractive but nevertheless strange and in some ways very repulsive landowners of the Russian countryside, and now he was praising the very things that his literature early had seemed to attack, and for which, as a matter of fact, he'd gotten considerable fame, not only in the Russian reading public in general. Remember now, the Russian reading public was a very small portion of the population. Not only in the Russian reading public in general, but particularly among the liberals and even the radicals who were trying to change the system. And now, all of a sudden, he seemed to be kissing the hand that previously had slapped him. This came to a head through the character of a very famous critic in Russia who played an extremely important part in Russian literature, not only with Gogol, and who, of course, had discovered Gogol that is, who had praised Gogol highly when Gogol's play first came on the scene. The man's name is Vissarion Belinsky. He was a man of rather poor origins. That is, he was not an aristocrat, but rather a product of the so-called raznochinцы in Russia, often sons and daughters of priests. The Russian clergy in the lower part of the church were able to marry and to have families. And he was a man of tremendous passion and also a man of considerable literary perception, because it was Belinsky who praised Pushkin at a time when Pushkin's reputation was beginning to go down right after his death. It was Belinsky who saw that Pushkin was the great figure that he indeed was. It was Belinsky who saw Gogol as a great writer when he saw the Inspector General in Red Dead Souls, and as we'll soon discover in future lectures, it was Belinsky who discovered Dostoevsky, the young Dostoevsky, when he'd never written anything before. I wouldn't mind, as a critic, having a reputation like that of discovering such geniuses. When Belinsky wrote, it was a different story. He often wrote at great length. Sometimes it was very hard to read. Sometimes you didn't even want to go along with him. He said in 10 pages what a better writer could have said in a paragraph or two. And yet the things that he said were often very powerful and very affecting in Russian literature. He had started out as a kind of a follower of Hegel, but then there was a turn in his life, and instead he became one of the most powerful protagonists of the radicals in Russia who wanted to change Russia drastically, who saw the terrible underside of the Tsarist system, and who was ready to virtually give his life for overturning the whole system. When he saw what was happening with Gogol, of course, he was furious. And taking advantage of the fact that he'd gone to Germany to take the waters because he was sick with consumption at that point, he wrote a very famous letter. Ironically enough, in Germany at that time, it was much more free than it was in Russia. And that letter has become a kind of a classic in Russian literature. His rage, he says, proponent of the knout, apostle of ignorance, upholder of obscurity and darkness, panegyrist of Tatar morals, what are you doing? That you base such teaching on the Orthodox Church, I can understand. The Church has always been the supporter of the knout, the handmaid of despotism. And he went on to say in another part of the letter, as soon as the Russian peasant thinks of the priest, he thinks of someone who's dirty, who's ignorant, who doesn't know what he's doing, who's a crook. But why have you mixed Christ in here? What have you found in common between him and any church, much less the Russian Orthodox Church? He first brought the teachings of liberty, equality, and fraternity to the people. All of a sudden, Christ becomes the French Revolution, and by his martyrdom placed the seal of truth on that teaching, and this was the salvation. He who suffers at the sight of other people's sufferings, who's grieved when other people are oppressed, bears Christ in his breast, and doesn't have to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. When Gogol received this letter, he was crushed. He literally collapsed. It was some time after that he died, a very sick man. A priest whom he had known tried to get him to fast for a long time, and of course he died to a certain extent of undernourishment. One of the most terrible things is that he died with leeches hanging from that magnificent nose of his. The end of Gogol was a very sad end, and yet it can't make us forget the fact that he was a magnificent writer producing marvelous masterpieces.